May the words of my mouth and meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
Please be seated. You'll no doubt recognize the sermon that Jesus just relates to us in Luke's Gospel. You might find its context and its title to be a little bit different than what you've heard. Whatever the instance, the reality is that today we reflect upon, and I have the opportunity to preach on, the Beatitudes. I remember when I was first introduced to the term Beatitudes, I kept wanting to tell everybody around me it was the Beauty-tudes. And it can be that. And it is a challenge to watch this expand, to understand the similarities and differences between the Sermon on the Mount, as we hear the Beatitudes in Matthew's Gospel, and this titled The Sermon on the Plain in Luke's Gospel. And I never could understand why these two disciples, these two apostles, these two riders of Jesus could not agree on something so basic as to where Jesus' most important and first sermon took place. Is it a mountain or is it in the plains? I grew up where the difference between mountains and plains is pretty stark. Some of you have a perception of Colorado that is nothing but high mountains, lofty peaks, quaking aspen, and fir trees, skiers and the like, right? How many of you have that perception of is that what you think of when you think of Colorado? Well, if you're coming from the east, you have to endure about 185 miles of an extension of western Kansas. It is no mistake, it is no coincidence that the first white settlers that crossed these United States in covered wagons thought they were losing their minds as they first saw the Rocky Mountains. You can see them from over 120 miles away. And that's with the smog of today in the Denver area. You can still see them that far away. And they would travel day after day after day and seem to be no closer. Life in God can be like that for us sometimes. Our march toward the truth of the Beatitudes can sometimes feel like we're just walking in place. It can be like being on the treadmill and struggling to keep up. I don't know about you, but at the first of every year you see all the New Year's resolution videos of people trying to go too fast on the treadmill and getting thrown off. And so I just don't go to the gym. It looks dangerous to me. Stay where you are. Nothing bad can happen, right? Well, that's not the case. We are called as people of God to continue to move toward the horizon before us. The horizon before us, the extended horizon, as the Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner said, is the infinite horizon that God calls us to. God keeps beckoning us to the beyond, to the next place, that we are on a journey that takes a lifetime. It can seem at times like venturing toward those mountains. Now, it was no great accomplishment, or in fact, no great consolation to arrive at those mountains for the first people who were crossing the plains. I just finished reading a book called Canoeing the Mountains by Todd Bolsinger. We've talked about it. In fact, Todd will be inviting some of you all to come, I think, to a day-long seminar. Todd Bolsinger is going to be talking about this book. It's called Canoeing the Mountains. It's about church growth. He's a Presbyterian, now teaches at Fuller Theological Seminary. But he uses this language of canoeing the mountains to talk about the situation that we are in the church today. And it's from the Lewis and Clark expedition. They canoed up the Missouri River, expecting to find at its headwaters a ridge that they would go over, and they would find a corresponding stream that would take them sweetly and easily down to the west coast. No problem, right? Well, as they crossed the plains of Montana, and they got to the Rocky Mountains, They got to the top of that first ridge, and what did they see? Another 100 miles of ridges. And some of them much higher than the one they were on. And so their skill at water navigation no longer served them to go the rest of the way. They needed to adapt how they were going to get to the destination that had been given. And they had to decide whether to turn back or whether to keep going. It was interesting, and I'll share this with you. One of the most interesting things I found out of this book was Todd Bolsinger's description of effective leadership in this age, at the age that they had, we have today in the church and that they had in the Lewis and Clark expedition. The effective leadership they had was the knack of being able to disappoint people at a rate they could accept. Because nothing ever goes exactly as planned. We have to understand that we are forced to adapt to what's coming to us. And our adaptation, I think, comes more easily when we embrace the reality of the Beatitudes. And I think when we embrace the reality, in particular, of Luke's Beatitudes, at least I get a more complete picture of recognizing what life is really like. And mostly it's contained in kind of its posture. Now, the other thing, they can't agree whether it's on the plains or on the mountain. All right, I get that now, having been to the Mount of the Beatitudes. They still call it just the Mount. Matthew's version gets top billing always. But it is a hill that has a gentle plain that finds its way down to the shores of the Sea of Galilee. So I can understand that it's challenging, geographically speaking. It's not so important where it happened, but what is said. And in my opinion, which is only my opinion, and it is not based in any biblical scholarship of note, I think Matthew may have pulled a few of Jesus' punches. Now, remember that Jesus is someone who got in his biggest trouble for telling the truth, not about making things up, and about speaking hard truths to people who didn't want to hear them. So how do the Beatitudes start in Matthew? Blessed are the poor in spirit. You said the poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit. That's not what Luke said. Blessed are the poor. Now, in the richest country in the world, if you could look around you today, look at the advertising we see, you look at what we are urged to try and acquire for ourselves, tell me if you really believe that we are a Christian country that believes Jesus' words that says, blessed are the poor. We live in a society that says, blessed are you that have more than anybody else, because that's the way we keep score. And with all due respect to those who preach the prosperity gospel, I think it is a perversion of understanding the word and intention of Jesus. Jesus is not suggesting that we need to make ourselves intentionally poor so that we can be blessed. It's an elusive truth that we're finding in these words that don't translate particularly well. Luke sets up a both and. He has a corresponding woe to every blessing. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm conditioned that woe also always sparks in me the danger of self-indulgent pity, right? Because the sentence most typically uttered in my heart and mind is, woe is me, right? It's all about me. I had met a guy one time at a clergy conference, and he introduced himself, and he said, well, enough about me. Tell me, what do you think about me? The reality of this is that it is not all about us, or it's not all about you, or it's not all about me, but it is all about us together. We talked in Bible study this morning that we need to be very careful in Scripture when we hear and read the word you, and recognize that the address of that word is ambiguous in our language, but in Greek it would not have been. In Aramaic it would not have been. In Hebrew it would not have been. That's why there's an advantage to living in the South. We would more accurately say, blessed are y'all. When you were poor. Blessed are y'all when you are persecuted for my sake. Blessed are y'all when you are hungry. Because we understand in those times our own inadequacy. Jeremiah, I think, gives us the key to understanding the Beatitudes in the text that we heard from Jeremiah today. Cursed are those who trust in their mortals and make flesh their strength. Their hearts turn away from the Lord. It's not just their bodies he's talking about, but it's saying that we are not self-sufficient, that we are made for community, we are made for interdependence, most especially on God, and to recognize that God speaks to most of us, not in a voice from above. How many of you heard the distinct voice of God audibly this week telling you precisely what you should do? That's a comfort. How many of you have heard the direct voice of God telling you this week what someone else ought to do? That's even more comforting. That's, I think, one of the biggest challenges is that we face, that the voice of God is oftentimes heard by those who claim to have heard it, not to change their own lives, but as a pronouncement for other people to change theirs. The Beatitudes are an orientation for groups of people to recognize that in their midst at any time are people who are hungry, and that we have the opportunity as partners with God to bless them by sharing in our abundance. Among us as a community at any time are people who are mourning, and we have the opportunity, the privilege, to help lift their burdens. At any given time in community, there are people around us who are lost and feel hopeless. And we have the opportunity to extend to them encouragement, to simply be with them in their presence. The woes in Luke can be a bit more challenging. I looked up the word in Greek this week, and one of the ways to translate this word is not woe, but alas. And if you read this text substituting those words, I think it makes a little bit more sense and is a little bit more palatable, at least to understanding that there is going to be ebb and flow in life. What does it say? Alas, you are laughing now, you will mourn. Alas to you when people speak well of you, for that's what their ancestors did to the prophets. Our lives ebb and flow. There are good times and there are bad times. And the most important thing that we can do is to recognize that we as a community of faith have access to the whole body of God in the community that we share around a common table. Just a little bit personal as I bring this to a close and tell you what the Beatitudes have meant to me and how that's been most deeply experienced in my life. Yesterday was the 21st anniversary of the death of my daughter. And this year was especially poignant in that on Thursday night, I found out that one of my former parishioners, their 56-year-old son died. They were people that I bonded with very early on when I was at St. Luke's in Worcester because their 4-year-old daughter had died at the parish picnic some 30 years before that. Came to find out that we had about 6 or 8 couples in this small congregation who had suffered the loss of a child, the death of a child. Somebody challenged me one time, I try not to say loss of a child. I haven't lost her, I know where she is. The death of a child. And nothing in my life has been more challenging. And on the Sunday after, she died on a Monday, she died on President's Day Monday. And on the Sunday after that, was the day after we had had her memorial service. She was 7 at the time and deeply involved in Sunday school. We had a lot of kids in that parish. And we talked to the children, which was, I thought was going to be the hardest and the worst thing to do. And it was actually the most healing thing that I could have done on that day. And I talked to the congregation as a whole in just thanking them. And the Beatitudes became so real to me as I stood before the congregation that day and I understood that Charles Dickens' words at the beginning of A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, and it was the worst of times. It was the worst of times for obvious reasons. It was the best of times because I knew viscerally that the Beatitudes were true. I was blessed in my mourning because I had people who cared and who didn't try and fix it. I was blessed when I was weeping because I had people that wept with me. I was blessed when I hungered for answers because people didn't try and provide me with simple platitudes, but was with me in my discomfort. I don't know about being persecuted. I don't know from that. I've been very fortunate. But the Beatitudes are available to us when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable and to recognize that it is in community, it is in this body of Christ, resurrected and at work in the world, that we can find some sort of level ground to travel. That we can travel that good plane toward the refreshing waters. And we can do it more comfortably when we travel together. Blessed are we in our poverty, because we understand that we need God first, and that God speaks to us through one another. Eugene Peterson translated parts of the Beatitudes in Matthew's Gospel as, "Blessed are you when you're at the end of your rope. Then there is less of you and more of God on which to grasp." So as we continue on our journey toward transformation, our journey toward the renewing of what our vision is, the continuing exercise of our ministry, let us be remembered remember when we feel like that we are at the end of our rope, that is when we are most blessed.